Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and I am so honored to be joined by one of my favorite guests who hasn't been on in a while, but we're so happy to have them back. That would be the Associate Provost, Dr. Jared Rife. Dr. Rife will be presenting Dawn of the Dead, Zack Snyder's 2004 reimagining of George Romero's original Dawn of the Dead. That will take place on Friday, October 27th at 6 o'clock in the Capitol Blue Cross Theater. So today, we are going to introduce that. We're going to talk a bit more about some of these films, about maybe the zombie subgenre in general, and maybe how some of these films have changed over the years, as well as some of the underlying messages that came out of some of the originals and kind of where we are today with some of these films. So, Dr. Rife, welcome back to the program.
I'm excited to be here. It has been a while. This is wonderful to be back in the studio with you.
Well, trust me, anytime that you would like to be here, you are more than welcome. But again, today we are celebrating the upcoming CPC Film Series. So we've had a really nice run of film series events. In fact, at the summer edition, where we had Dylan Bowman screen 2 of films that he was involved with, we had one of the largest contingencies of fans ever that we have had with this CPC Film Series that I believe we started in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And I say we because it was essentially you and I and a group of other people, and we've still been able to do it, and it's still being very successful. So this is one of the first times we're ever doing sort of a themed, sort of Halloween CPC Film Series. So first of all, let's start talking about the film. You're going to be doing Dawn of the Dead, but not the original, the 2004 remake from Zack Snyder, who also directed 300, Watchmen, and of course has been involved in different Superman and Justice League projects. So I guess the first question is, why this film?
That is an excellent question. I think for several reasons. I wasn't sure how well a student-receptive audience would be to the original. For those of you who have seen the George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, it doesn't quite look right now. The zombies have essentially like purple makeup on their faces, and you can tell that there's no fear there with it. So this is a way for us to, I think, for me to kind of bring in a slightly younger audience, because there is a little more action to it. There's a little more suspense, and I think it's a little more to what normally what students are used to seeing when they go for their movie experience. Also, because I think there's still a couple of things that we can tease out of this movie that's almost soon to be 20 years old at this point, starting this next year. So I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to kind of talk about it, and then I'm also excited to show it for a lot of people who perhaps have not seen it.
You know, this is one that I have not seen, and honestly, this has never been something, a subgenre that I've been overly interested in. I'm not much of a horror genre person. I do appreciate the Scream films. I've seen certainly all of those. I haven't seen the newest one yet, but yes, I will get to that probably this month sometime. Horror has just never really been my thing. I would say I did enjoy Get Out when Leslie Heimbosch showed that a few years back, and I guess some people kind of classify that as horror,
Sure.
Although I think you could certainly argue that might fall in other places. But movies like that, I do enjoy it. For whatever reason, I never got into zombie films. And in fact, I have a lot of friends who are into Walking Dead.
Sure.
And apparently I'm odd because I've never gotten to see that. I mean, what is it about zombie films, maybe just in general, that speaks to you, whereas it might not to everyone?
No, I can understand that. And the horror genre is huge, right? So as we talk about this subgenre within the zombie piece itself, and it's funny you mentioned just quickly The Walking Dead. It's around this time that Robert Kirkman, who is the creator of The Walking Dead, the comic book, and then helps obviously inform the TV, now ended TV series, but the spinoffs as well. He's beginning to really get the steam rolling with The Walking Dead comic book. About this time comes out. So the film itself is kind of sets off a little bit. The 26 Days Later came out just a few years before. But in terms of the subgenre itself, the zombie is a fascinating idea. It has deep roots within the horror literary circles. This idea of even kind of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it being a prime example of what happens when you kind of transcend this boundary, right? Because everything dies. Everything has to kind of pass over this veil into an unknown territory. So what happens when something is able to come back to life, even if it's even a fraction of what that life used to be? And that is a kind of a form of horror that I don't think people always deal with. Other writers and other filmmakers have dealt with this idea a lot. Another kind of, I think, a good place if people are interested in thinking about it would be Stephen King's Pet Sematary. And what happens when the beloved pets that you have are able to kind of come back. But as with all things, right, going into this realm or this place where death resides or where things die, you don't always come back the same way. And so I think the zombie film is a way for, or literature or comic book or whatever the medium is a way for you to kind of, I think, for people to deal with death and how they handle death, and realizing that there is a permanence to it, but at the same time, what happens when you're altering that permanence? How does that make you feel? And I think the horror genre overall is meant to kind of push us to ask questions, often about fear, often about loss, often about death. And so the zombie really just kind of plays into that. Now, I think what's fun about zombies is that they, in order to live, they have to consume you, right? And there's variations of it, right? They can just eat you, or they have to eat your brains, or whatever it is, right? But in order for the dead to be alive, they have to eat the living. And so you get this other kind of mix into what makes this terrifying and what makes this thing. And I mean, we could talk more about why we pursue fear as a an avenue of exploration, but that's what I really appreciate about the kind of the zombie genre.
We can't really talk much more about this without talking about sort of the father of this horror subgenre, and that's George Romero. He came out with Night of the Living Dead in 1968, and really kind of, not to say that there weren't things in this realm prior to that, but really popularized this idea of the zombie subgenre, which, again, you mentioned, not only just through his own films, spawned a variety of other films, and basically any zombie film, television show, what have you, that has been made since is really an homage to Romero's original 6 films, which I actually, as I was getting ready for today, he had 6 in this series and several more in development when he passed away.
Yep.
So he was going to do an entire franchise of these sort of the dead films. So what was so special about George Romero back then? Why was it culturally significant at that time, back in the late 60s and into the 70s?
Well, as with all things kind of entertainment, film, TV, right? If it catches just to the right time in terms of the public consciousness, or in terms of the zeitgeist of what people are thinking and feeling. So at this point, we are, the baby boomer generation is, almost about to cut off. We're starting to get into Vietnam. This heyday of the 50s and early 60s is really kind of beginning to crumble, as a lot of the organizations, a lot of the institutions within the U.S., in terms of civil rights, in terms of indigenous rights, in terms of the environmentalism, all begin to be are hyped up and are at that point. And then we also see this kind of rise in consumerism beginning to really flourish. And obviously we see that today with where we find ourselves in our own society. And so Romero was able to kind of capture this idea of what happens when our idyllic life, especially The Night of the Living Dead, his first film, what happens when that idealism and this perfect kind of society that we look begins to crumble. What happens when we tear these things apart with things that can't be stopped, right? There's this great scene in The Night of the Living Dead where there's this argument taking place in this newsroom where these different kind of talking heads are going at each other, trying to figure out, because they're trying to communicate to the public about what's going on and what needs to happen, and they're trying to be this upstanding journalistic news organization. And really, at that time, television news was everything, was all the rage. It was where you went to for everything, and you had confidence in it. And the one anchor is saying, listen, he's like, something needs to be done, because these things, they get up and they eat you. And when they eat you, you turn into it too. So what is going to make it stop? Because nothing is going to stop it unless something happens, right? And it kind of just sits, and that question lingers in the film. what happens when things begin to deteriorate? What happens when this life that we've built begins to crumble at a societal level, at a family level, at a nation level, right? And so that, I think, really is where Romero was able to kind of catch that, and it struck people, and it was given in the kind of this cool, fun way of zombies. And for those who, again, have seen it, right, it's the makeup is just, you look at it now and you're like, what did they think that was,
I mean, it was well over 50 years ago, so
Yeah.
I mean, you got to give it a little bit of credit.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's still, I mean, you chuckle at it now, but it definitely struck a chord and helped kind of revitalize, especially in Hollywood, the horror genre and the fear genre. And not that they didn't know that before, because horror has always been, even from the earliest films, right, this idea of fear has always been an important motivator. But if you could couch it in these very specific terms of kind of fear inducing, and you could make money at it.
One of the interesting things that I thought, as you were sharing this, 68, Night of the Living Dead, really kind of preempts even some of the later films in Romero's catalog, some of the most iconic horror films. From the Nightmare on Elm Street to Friday the 13th, they're all starting late 70s, early 80s, and it almost seems to me that these Romero films were sort of the gateway to some of the most iconic films that we saw in terms of the things that we associate with horror. Even Child's Play was early 90s.
Yep.
So, I mean, the impact and influence that Romero had on the entire horror genre most certainly shouldn't be understated. I do want to come back to a point that you made earlier about Romero's films. You talked a lot about consumerism, and if we think back to 1968, of course, we're, Vietnam War time, post JFK, but really what has happened is after we got back from World War II, up until the 60s, when we started getting into these conflicts, I mean, it was a good time in America for not only our economy, but just our well-being and our state of mind. And so, how does this time frame that Night of the Living Dead is released in 1968 and all the things that are going around it, like, what was the idea of some of the underlying messaging in Romero's, at least original film?
Sure. Well, especially with the Dawn of the Living Dead, which takes place in a mall, and so does the film that we'll be watching, the Zack Snyder's film, also takes place in a mall, is this idea of consumerism and kind of conspicuous consumption really begin to kind of take hold. We've seen at this point, especially in 68, the automobile is now well versed into the American consciousness. Television, well established. We're beginning to see, with this onset of television, we begin to see the beginnings of kind of sports. Instead of coming over the radio, begins to be televised. And with that becomes all sorts of marketing that we find in newspapers and in TV and still in radio. And so the idea in which we are able to obviously distinguish ourselves in this time period is by the things that you have, the things that you consume. And so one of Romero's commentaries on his film was this idea of these zombies kind of come back to the mall, and there's this dialogue between two of the main characters that the one woman's like, why are they here? Like, what brought this? And the gentleman's like, well, it's some instinct they have, right, to just come back. And his use of the word instinct is fascinating because it almost has this biological determinism to it, that within a generation we have morphed ourselves, that the place you go as a zombie is the place you spent a lot of time, which was the mall. And so what does that say about us? And we obviously continue to see this today. I had one of my children the other day say, oh, Dad, did you see the new iPhone came out? Right? We've been kind of preconditioned to purchase these things, to use these things, to have these things. And so this old kind of, earlier, Depression era mantra of, use it or, make it do or do without, right? If you can't resole your shoes, then it's a problem. Whereas now you just go buy a new pair of shoes. So what does this consumerism say about us? How has this woven itself into the fabric, not of just our society, but also into us perhaps individually? And what will this continue to do? And so that's kind of this fun kind of front bookend to Romero's film. And then you contrast that later with Snyder's film, which also takes place in a mall. But in 2004, your malls are beginning to wane. Right? The malls are beginning to die. It's not the place where you go to hang out. It's the place where you maybe a void, or the places are empty, or it's the place where,
Desolate.
yeah, where your seniors are going to walk because it's open space inside.
I worked at the mall for a long time, and that is one of the big things that happens there, I will say.
Yeah. And so what does that say when consumerism shifts away from this? And this is, during the early internet stages, where you could begin to buy things online. So what does that say now that we are fully, and with the pandemic just a few years ago, things like Amazon are just now everything, right? That is, again, another way that this consumerism weaves itself into the fabric of who we are.
So I appreciate that you transitioned over to the Zack Snyder film, obviously, because that's the film we're going to be watching, and that's the film you're going to be breaking down, although I'm sure you'll talk some about Romero.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit more about how, without giving away too much in case people haven't seen this one, how are the two films narratively different?
Well, we see obviously the difference between the directors themselves. Romero was very much a classic, right, kind of director. He wanted to not just tell a story, but he wanted there to be some jabs that he kind of took at. In this case, taking at consumerism, or with kind of American exceptionalism, or the other ideas of kind of the waxing family. You still get that with Snyder, but you get very much more of a Snyder DNA and fingerprints, all of this. And most people are probably going to know Snyder from his bigger, more comic book type adaptations, where it's a lot of action. It's a little light on maybe the dialogue or the plot. And so those are one of the main differences. Snyder is commentating less, whereas George, Mr. Romero, is commenting more. The action sequences in the Snyder version are very much more in your face, more enjoyable, more of what you want when you spend, $10, $12, $14, whatever it is, to go be entertained for a few hours and to kind of come away chuckling. And by and large, this version with Snyder really hits the mark. He really is able to kind of make those action sequences enjoyable and pleasurable, and you kind of think, oh, this is great. The place of it taking care, the Romero's film actually takes place in Pennsylvania. The Snyder one takes place just outside of Milwaukee, but there's still kind of this feel of kind of suburban residence and a little bit of decay as things kind of happen. The other thing is that where Romero's takes a little while to kind of build up, within like the first 15 minutes of Snyder's film, like it's on, like you like it is, there isn't like a build up. We don't get like, this nice beginning of this story arc or what's going on. It happens very quickly. And so there's this frantic feel to Snyder's cut, which really kind of induces the audience to feel it as well. There is, though, one thing that I find really enjoyable between that, and there's been an article or two that people have written about it, the Muzak, the M-U-Z-A-K, right, that music they play in like department stores, that kind of features in both, although in Snyder's cut, they kind of like make fun of it a little bit and kind of poke fun of it. So yeah, those are some of the differences, some of the similarities.
Well, I do want to point out that Zack Snyder's cut of Dawn of the Dead did receive a 7.3 on IMDb, which, it doesn't sound great, but when the best movies of all time are 9.0s, 7.3 is actually very, very commendable. Really, anything over a 7 is highly regarded in the film industry. It did have a $26 million budget, but grossed $102 million worldwide, basically 4 times its budget. We were talking about this off air. What I found very interesting about this particular film is Snyder had only ever been a music video director, and was essentially handed not only a $26 million budget for his first film, but also unbelievable intellectual property. I mean, to remake a classic film like this as your first film with a massive budget, I mean, that's got to be a lot of pressure.
Yeah. He really had only done like the music videos, like some few commercials. He was relatively unknown. Whereas today, he's perhaps seen. I mean, you could argue against it, but he's perhaps seen as kind of an A-list,
absolutely,
director. He's up there. Your names that you're going to want to do it. And yeah, I think the way that he set up his music videos really convinced somebody, right, to just say, okay, let's take this flyer out. And, in 2004 dollars, $26 million is a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money today, right? It was a lot of money then. But for them to be able to essentially quadruple their revenue on that and to be able to make that back, it's propelled him. It really is. In fact, some will, I've as you kind of look through and read some of these reviews and people talking about it now, people say maybe this was his best kind of work because he's become so kind of extreme as he kind of produces these things and shows these things. And you can see that with the Snyder cut that it came out a few years ago that people were clamoring for, that Warner Brothers was, reluctant to do. But yeah, I think sometimes you just kind of grind within the entertainment industry and eventually you find your mark. And we know a lot of people who don't, and he just happened to hit with this.
And again, to your point, he did go on to direct 300, Watchmen, Superman vs. Batman, Justice League. I mean, he's got an unbelievable mark of films and probably well over $500 million in revenue, if not well over that, just in those handful of films by themselves. So it is pretty incredible. The last thing I wanted to just mention here before we get out of here today, in terms of the sort of zombie subgenre, was the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Early days of the pandemic, when we were all just sort of learning what we were up against, a lot of people pointed back to things like 26 Days Later, where a virus caused some sort of zombie apocalypse. And of course, while we understand that COVID didn't create zombies, it was that feeling like, oh my gosh, this thing that we kind of laughed at and chuckled at is actually happening to some extent. What impact do you think that, since we've all been together with that, does that have on this subgenre of films moving forward, now that we've kind of actually seen a preview of what it could be?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think in some ways these zombie films, the TV show like The Walking Dead, I don't want to say it prepared us, but I think, I'm going to say that. It kind of prepared or conditioned us for us to be like, okay, how do I survive this, right? And these survival kind of instincts and tactics and the hoarding of things we saw, especially, I remember those first few days in the pandemic, toilet paper was gone.
Days?
Yeah.
I mean, how about the first few months?
Well, we had a lot of toilet paper, so maybe I only thought about it for the first few days. But we have been conditioned to kind of think about that. And I think the pandemic helped us kind of understand about how we need to either avoid people or stay safe or whatever that might be, however you kind of approached it. I am curious to see how the pandemic will affect these movies going forward. I mean, I feel like we've seen a few movies now where they reference the pandemic happening in it, right? They're masked up, they keep their distance, but we haven't really seen too much kind of born out of that within this time period, right? Like a post-COVID world. Everything continues to be kind of pre-COVID or is so fantastic, right? That this idea of that. So I think if I were to guess and kind of look into a crystal ball, although I wouldn't put any money on it, I think the zombie and the horror genres always ask us to big questions about who we are, right? And for a lot of zombie shows, it's how do you approach things when all of the hallmarks of your life, all the touchstones of civilization deteriorate? What is left? What's after being stripped away? What remains? Is it this? Is it a calloused individual? Is it a person who has hope or humanity? Is it this? Some taking little bits and pieces of it, or this kind of survival mentality? And so having now experienced that as a worldwide phenomenon, in order for these films or TV shows or whatever to really kind of register, they're going to have to explore and ask different questions that they did, because now everyone's kind of experienced.
We already have the answers.
Yeah, we already know. I already know what I'm going to do if I have to stay in my house for 2 months or 3 months, or we run out of toilet paper. That isn't scary to me anymore. So I don't think the questions will be answered by more gore or more. I mean, it always will. You'll always have, babies being caught in microwaves, right? You'll always have these kind of ridiculous over-the-top things. But if they're really going to want to register with a viewing audience, they're going to have to ask deeper questions about what it means to be a human and how we kind of survive. Because for a lot of people now, it's not scary.
Which leads us really to our final point here. One of the stories that as we look through and we're getting ready to send the publication out to be printed, Nick Hogan, who's our CPC Film Series correspondent, did a piece about some of the summer blockbusters and about how, when you hear about Indiana Jones, for instance, the really negative commentary that came out about it because, it only made $20 million over the budget and it's all automatically this flop. It really speaks to what does the viewing public look for right now in terms of big budget films. So many flops in terms of superhero movies, which were always a guaranteed moneymaker. And then you see films like Barbie and Oppenheimer. While, I guess you don't necessarily want to call Barbie an original film because it's, using borrowed intellectual property. But the way that it was made was so creative. And of course, I'm a huge Christopher Nolan fan, so I love Oppenheimer. But what you're seeing here is films that are different, films that are outside of the box. And I think that for at least the last decade to 15 years, these film companies are just cashing in on the same ideas over and over and over. And I hope that by seeing a film like Barbie and Oppenheimer be so successful this year, they kind of understand that, listen, we are not stupid people as an American public in terms of our film, the films that we enjoy. Give us something of quality and we're going to go out and see it. So I just think that when you see something like 2004's Dawn of the Dead, and you look back, they did and paid such great homage to the original while still making it fun and different. Like, that's the stuff we want to see. We don't just want to keep seeing rehashed stuff over and over. And if you are going to use an intellectual property that already exists, make it fresh. So I'm so pleased to have had you here today, Jared. Again, one more time, that's Friday, October 27th. Dr. Jared Rife will be presenting Dawn of the Dead in the Capitol Blue Cross Theater at 6 p.m. It's going to be supporting the Nightly News Media Club, so come on out and bring a few bucks and have some refreshments and get to hear a really, really cool presentation beforehand. Check out the film and get you into the Halloween spirit, and we'll be able to check that out for another edition of our film series. So, Dr. Rife, thank you so much for chatting here today. And gosh, I could sit here and talk with you about movies all afternoon, but I certainly appreciate your commentary here, and I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
Of course. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Nightly News Podcast. Again, I wanted to thank the Associate Provost, Dr. Jared Rife. Again, that's Friday, October 27th, 6 o'clock in the Capitol Blue Cross Theater, so we'll see you then. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Nightly News Podcast. We'll see you again next time.
I'm Dylan Bowman, former president of the Nightly News, and you're listening to the Nightly News Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and I'm so honored to be joined by another new person to the Nightly News Podcast. I'd like to welcome Kenton Alston. Kenton, welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure to get to chat with you and finally get to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited.
Well, that's very polite of you. So you are working with the athletics department. You're also doing some activities here as well. So we're going to break down not only the slate of athletics that we have coming up in the exciting next month, as well as later in the show, I'll cover some of the important events that you can mark your calendar for. But let's start at the beginning. What brings you to Central Penn College? How did you end up here? And tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Absolutely. I'm blessed to be here. Me and Casey have been in touch for the last few years while I was at Stilton High-Spire High School coaching their high school basketball team. But this has kind of been a process going on for the last few years, and the timing aligned. So being here from the coaching aspect and now being here full-time as the activities and athletics coordinator, it's a blessing. I'm excited to be here and to help our student athletes grow.
Now, so you are the assistant coach for the men's basketball team.
Yes.
Under Coach Martin, who has been on the show before, and he's a wonderful human being. We get along very well, and probably the most polite person I've ever met in my life. Every time I see him, although I'm sure if I was on the team, I might have a different opinion. But no. So yeah, we are going to talk a bit more about the basketball season coming up, and of course the broadcasts that the Nightly News will be doing. But let's start off with soccer. There are 3 big matches as we come back for the fall term post when this podcast is going to be released. So just keep in mind, October 18th at 4 o'clock is the men's senior night versus Manor. October 20th, of course, coming into homecoming weekend, there will be a doubleheader against Penn State Schuylkill at 5 and 7. And October 23rd is the final game of the year, the women's soccer team senior night versus Manor on October 23rd. Now, of course, all of those are over on City Island at the soccer field just behind FNB Field. So please come out, bring a sweatshirt, and come see us. But let's talk a little bit about the soccer team. So you've been instrumental since you've come here in several things just that I've noticed. First of all, the quality of work that you're doing, putting into the website. Of course, you can always go to centralpennknights.com and for all of the news and rosters and schedules. Of course, some of these schedules are tentative and subject to change, but so you can always go there for updated information. But one of the first things that you did hitting the ground running is you've really, really boosted the amount of content that's being put up on that website. So tell us a little bit about that and maybe any learning curves that you've had and what you've kind of learned from that process.
Oh, there's always learning curves for sure, Paul. Like websites and internet, there's always obstacles and issues to get through. But to be able to highlight our student athletes and our amazing programs, that's the key. Like that's why I put my passion into it and put my passion into these articles to be able to promote our student athletes more and more timely. So I have to give that back to you, Paul, because you guys do an amazing job. So just trying to do the same thing and just to be able to promote our staff, our athletes, our coaches, like that's why I'm passionate about it.
I love it. And one thing I will say is we in the past had done some soccer streams, and we've definitely gotten to do a few home games this year in terms of the streaming as well. Of course, you can find all of that at Nightly News, a media club at Central Penn College on YouTube. And pretty much every article you give a shout out to our YouTube channel, which is greatly appreciated. I would say that from a variety of perspectives, these two soccer seasons have been really phenomenal. First of all, the high play of the men's team. I know that you've gotten out and seen, all of the games, the home games. So tell us a little bit more about what's it like to be out at Skyline Sports Complex and getting to see these student athletes really competing at a high level on a professional field.
Oh, it's wonderful. And you just said it perfectly with it being a professional field. I think it's an amazing location with the views and everything of the city of Harrisburg. It's an amazing place to play right next to F&B Stadium. It's awesome. It's just kind of like, it's nostalgic for me. City Island's a historic place in Harrisburg. So for those guys and girls to be able to play there and have that as their home field is great. The men's team to start off first, they're amazing. They're 9-1-1 now, undefeated in conference. They're doing an amazing job. I feel like they're growing every game just from watching those games and just getting better. And you can see the cohesiveness is just coming together as we get ready to hit playoff time. And then the women's, I'm just excited for them to get back out on the field. They've been dealing with some numbers issues, and even with some of the other teams in the conference. The last game was postponed due to a shortage for the other team, Mont Alto. So I'm just excited to see them get back on the field this week.
Well, and one thing, Casey was on the last podcast, and we actually got the chance to talk a little bit about some women's athletics and just in a general sense how difficult it is to get enough people to field out a roster in a lot of the different sports. Because even as far back as basketball season last year, we'd had a couple of postponements, and it's not because they didn't have enough people initially. It's because people do get hurt. We are playing sports, and no one's going to go through an entire season without missing a few games, and that's where things can get a little tricky because if you don't have enough people, you can't play. Absolutely. And so especially with how, I don't want to say relatively short, because ultimately the soccer season's the better part of 3 months. But, if you have somebody sprains an ankle, is out a week, and there's 2 games on that calendar for the week, what are you going to do? And that's what's always a frustration. But I do want to point out how proud we are of the women's team getting back out there and really fighting through some adversity and having some really good games this year too. But what can you say about the men's team? They're just... Frankly, it hasn't really been too competitive in a lot of the games. They've just been handling their business. And, we had Coach Osborne and Andrew Hunter on earlier in the year to preview, but they were extremely excited for how things were going to go. And it seems like all things are going quite well at this point.
Absolutely. And that's a kudos to the amazing leaders and the coaches, the coaching staff, Coach Osborne, Coach Grubeski. They're just amazing. And, doing a great job they're always great at promoting their student athletes, and we just want to do the same. So they're doing a great job, and it's a reflection in their players.
Now, before we move on to basketball, just from a comment that you just made right there, are you from Harrisburg?
I'm from Stilton originally, so
close enough.
Close enough, right around the corner. So this is still home for me. It's just right across the bridge. So I love being here. I still feel at home at Central Penn, and just excited. I feel it's kind of a small environment like Stilton is. Stilton's a small town. I feel like there's a lot of pride here. So that's some of the things that stood out to me and that helped bring me here.
So I'm also from Harrisburg. I was born in Harrisburg Hospital. Now I did live in Carlisle for most of my life, but I mean I've lived in this area from Lemoyne to Mechanicsburg to Carlisle. I mean, my whole entire life. And I feel the same way when I'm out on City Island too, especially when I get to call the games at FMB Field. It's just like a dream, man. Like it's I can't even put into words how excited and happy that it makes me that as part of my job, small part of my job, that I get to be out there with the guys during baseball season, but of course basketball too. So let's kind of move over to basketball. Of course, we will be broadcasting all of the home games this year. Of course, go to centralpennknights.com for more information about those games, but we are going to have a whole crew this year. I have a sports broadcasting class that we're in for the first time, so we're going to have producers, we're going to have color commentators, we're going to have photographers, we're going to have game day ops help. I mean, we're going to have a full crew. So we are so looking forward to these group of games coming up. And I know that you probably are looking forward to these games more than anyone, because our basketball teams have over the last few years really, really done some special things, from the women's team making the postseason for the first time in the recent history, having two amazing players over the last couple of years between Jalen Burton-Jones and Tania Jackson. And of course, the men's team, played really well last year, maybe not quite as well as they would have hoped. And I had Coach Martin on to talk about that, but certainly have some great things from coming into this season. So let's start there. Just generally with the way things stand here for our basketball programs, give us sort of, what are some things that we're looking forward to this year in the 23-24 season?
I would start first with the women's program. Their new coaching staff with Coach Stacia King coming from Duquesne University, Harrisburg graduate, as well as her assistant coach, Jasmine Poole. They were high school teammates, so their chemistry as coaches, I'm looking forward to see what they do on the court and what they bring to the table, because they're a hard-working group. They're going to expect the players to work hard. And there's a lot of girls coming back that are promising players. Sydney Green, just a lot of, even though we're losing some key pieces, I think there's some girls coming back that can really step up and fill those voids.
Well, what's really interesting was that, Tania was the sixth person, if you will, coming off behind Jalen Burton-Jones, and then now Carla Thomas is right behind Tania. So now is going to step up and kind of take that point guard. You want to talk about some shoes to fill. I mean, two guaranteed Central Penn Hall of Famers in our athletic department. But yeah, you do have some returning pieces, whether they're juniors, seniors, etc., some veterans coming back. And absolutely. I got to tell you, last year, calling their games was so much fun. They played so well as a team. And while of course, Tania stuck out, although she dealt with some injuries down the stretch last year. Some of the other players, like one day it would be Sydney Bubb, one day it would be Sydney Green. I mean, it was almost like every different game there was another player who stepped up, and that just was a testament to how well they were coached. And then now we're going to have two new coaches coming in. Speaking as somebody that's a new coach with Central Penn, how do you think that affects the players going from one coach to another between year to year? To what extent do you think that affects the gameplay?
It definitely has an impact, because coaches have different styles. So not too familiar with what's going to happen on the women's side as far as styles. Like, things change. You have to be open to change. And you mentioned it perfect earlier with players having to step up. So it's a part of the game. It's a part of any sport. Sometimes those seniors and those oldest people graduate. Who's the next person that's going to step up and fill that role? So they'll be fine. They'll be successful. But I know for me personally, transitioning into being in my first year coaching here, I just want to be here for the kids. So sometimes it's an adjustment, but I just try to be as supportive as possible as the assistant coach and try to alleviate anything I can for Coach Martin, just to make it easier for him and make life easier for our team.
Absolutely. And well, first of all, before we switch off of the women's team, mark your calendars for November 14th is the women's home opener at East Penn High School. So, and also please do check in case any schedule changes between now and the start of the season at centralpennknights.com. But I'm sure you have circled on your calendar November 21st. There will be a doubleheader versus Penn State Lehigh here at home, and it's going to feature the women and the men. So I know that you're looking forward to that home opener here at East Penn. So tell us a little bit more about kind of where you are in the off-season programs for the Knights men's basketball team, and maybe are there any new recruits coming in that we should keep an eye on?
Oh man, we have tons of recruits here. And before I came up here to with you, Paul, I was just with some of our new recruits in the weight room, just talking to them, kind of just giving them advice and encouragement. We're sitting pretty high numbers for recruiting, but it's intentional because Coach has plans on keeping the maximum amount of numbers as with what happened last year, just in preparation because things happen, like we mentioned earlier, injuries.
Well, and what you're talking about is, I think it got to one point, and it might have been a little different on the road, but I want to say the one night we only dressed 8 people, if I'm not mistaken, because there was a couple of injuries that happened. So, we had a full roster last year, but then, we lost a couple after the first term and gained a couple in the second term. So it was a challenge for the men's team. But I'll tell you the one thing I can always tell you is that team never quit. Never. Even if they were playing a tough team, maybe they got down, they started off slow, never quit. And they were in every single game that I called last year, every single one.
Yes, and we'll continue that same trend. Like I'm encouraging to the guys, like we're going to work hard, we're going to prepare, we're going to be ready for October 30th, which is our first scrimmage against Hack, and then November 6th, which is our first away game against Penn State Hazleton. So we'll be ready, we'll be working. Tomorrow starts our first day of actual tryouts practice. So this is week 1 for us, week 1 of school for the fall term, and week 1 for basketball as well. So I'm excited all around.
Well, we are too, and certainly, like I said, we are going to be broadcasting every home game live on our YouTube channel. Again, I can put that link along with this podcast, but hey, tune in, see what our sports broadcasting class is up to. Well, just before we get out of here, and I know as a coach this is not something that you typically like to do, but give us maybe 2 people coming in, new recruits that we should keep an eye out for going into the season.
Wow, there's so many, and I love all of our recruits because they're all the same type of kids. They're all coachable, come from great families, just working hard and willing to play that role. They're not looking to come in and be the star right away. Like they're willing to wait that time if that's what it takes. But Connor Jenkins is a new kid we have coming in that can step in right away and fill that void of Nate not being there, which is a huge void. We love Nate. But
Nate is one of my favorite people that I've ever had the opportunity to play with because, he has gone through a lot of adversity in his own right. And he was like the glue of that team. And when you lose a player like that, that is so difficult to find that person who's going to sort of step into that role. Yes. So, yes, we do miss Nate very much. And of course, but we can always go back and watch all of his highlights on our YouTube channel. But I'm glad that you've got some new people coming in. And I got to be honest with you, we are so excited to call these games. I absolutely love the fact that I get to do this as part of my job, and it's my honor and pleasure to get to be there with you every single home game, and we're just so looking forward to it, and I know it's going to be a good season.
Yes, this will be a great season, and I'm thankful for you guys, Paul, the whole Nightly News Media Club, the students, everybody that you have, your students, yourself. We're lucky to have you guys calling our games and to help us out, and I'm just excited to work alongside of you guys and help however I can.
Well, it's going to be a wonderful experience. So, just a few dates again. October 18th, men's senior soccer game versus Manor. We'll have October 20th, the doubleheader during homecoming at Penn State Schuylkill. October 23rd, women's soccer versus Manor. It's their senior night as well. Of course, the home opener for the women's basketball team is going to be on Tuesday, November 14th, followed by the following week, a doubleheader against Penn State Lehigh on November 21st. So I'm just can't say how excited I am, and fall is always a wonderful time. I hate that it gets colder, but I love that now the sports season starts back up. So it's such a pleasure to get to work with you and see what you can do with the men's team this year.
Yeah, I'm excited for the season. I'm excited to just get more comfortable being here, and I've already made some great relationships, and I'm excited to work more with you, Paul, and Nightly News Media Club. And any way you guys need me, I'm here for you guys.
I appreciate that. Now, Ken, before we get you out of here, I do want to kind of just go over a few really key events that we have this term. First of all, on October 18th from 10 to 4, Public Safety is sponsoring a blood drive through the Red Cross. So please, if you can at all, budget some time that day to go down and give blood on October 18th. Please do so. Of course, and we can talk about this a little bit more here, Ken, homecoming, October 20th and 21st. Of course, we're going to kick off homecoming this year with the Nightly News Hall of Fame celebration, which I cannot wait for, really recognizing 4 really important alumni and also the previous Hall of Famers as well. So that's going to be a lot of fun. But tell us a little bit more about what you have on tap at the soccer matches that evening.
Yeah, homecoming will be an amazing night, not only for our alumni, but for our current students that are coming coming here for this fall term. It'll be a great environment to be at, a doubleheader. 5 o'clock will be our women's game, 7 will be our men's. We'll have youth soccer teams there with the teams for each game. We'll be crowning the homecoming king and queen at halftime of the men's game. It'll just be an overall great event. Food, it'll be a recruit night. There's so much going on that night. It's going to be packed with fun, and it's going to be a great place to be. So if you can, make it out to Skyline and enjoy your evening.
And I want to put in a cheap plug. The Nightly News Media Club will be running concessions that evening, with the proceeds benefiting the club. So if you do stop out, please stop by and grab a hot dog or a drink or some candy, whatever you're interested in picking up from the concession stand. That will go to benefit the Nightly News. So we are very much looking forward to, of course, Fall Harvest as well. One of the big things that's going to be happening this year is I am and a few other people on campus are putting together a little historical exhibit.
That's
and
wonderful.
I actually get to do the exhibit on sports. So there are some trophies in the hub. We found some other materials not only in the library, but also in the Boyer House. So I think you're going to want to stop by during Fall Harvest into the library and check out the historical exhibit that we have. And of course, my individual display on the history of sports here at Central Penn. So, which I think is going to be really cool.
That's awesome.
October 26th at noon is Bras Across the Bridge, sponsored by the Colleges Against Cancer Club. So definitely want to make sure that we check it out for that. And then another event that I want everyone to put on their calendar is November 15th for the Career Closet, sponsored by Career Services, where if you need some professional clothing for an internship or job interview, you can go into the Career Closet and get free clothes. Brand new clothes in many cases, or gently used clothes. I got to tell you, it is a wonderful way to get your wardrobe, because you don't want to go out and get a new job and then have to go spend your first paycheck on clothes.
It's expensive.
Yeah, it's super expensive. So if you can get a few outfits before you start that internship, that'll save you a few bucks. So those are the big things. The October 18th blood drive from 10 to 4 in the theater. Homecoming weekend, October 20th and 21st, with not only the homecoming soccer matches, but also Fall Harvest on the 21st. October 26th at noon, we'll have Bras Across the Bridge. And then on November 15th, the Career Closet, sponsored by Career Services. Of course, you can check out the activities calendar for any and all of these things for more information, but I will also add some additional information to this story. Well, I think that's going to do it, Kenton. I hope that we can have you back every term and kind of get an update on how things are going with athletics and, updates that you have about the upcoming games that we have going on, because, coming into this season, there's going to be a lot of new things going on, new initiatives, new sports. I mean, we didn't even get to talk about cross country.
Absolutely. Cross country has been, they've done amazing. The whole team is full of first-year runners, some basketball players as runners. So it's amazing to see the campus growing. And that's one of the things that brought me here as well, is just the growing campus, the growing environment. The school's growing, athletics is growing, softball coming up in the spring. Just so many positive changes. And just to be able to be a part of that, and to be a part of the Nightly News Media Club, and to be on this podcast to help promote our student athletes. Like, you guys do an amazing job, so we're thankful for you guys, and I just try to do that on my end the best I can as well.
Fantastic. Well, I will have you down for the first time next term, and we will always come down and kind of preview what we have coming up that term. So
sounds great.
Kenton, thank you so much for your time today, man. It's a pleasure to have gotten to know you over the past few weeks, and certainly looking forward to getting to work with you throughout these next few seasons.
Thank you so much, Paul.
All right. That's going to do it for this episode of the Nightly News Podcast. Thank you so much to Kenton Alston for joining us today. This is Professor Paul Miller, and we'll see you again next time on the Nightly News Podcast.